Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking this time and joining me. My name is Hector Linares. I'm a program manager with the Azure Stack team. Specifically, I'm focused on business continuity and disaster recovery. The topic today is going to be specifically around recovering the infrastructure after catastrophic data loss. So if you haven't had a chance to see the list of sessions, we've got quite a bit covering Azure Stack. So they're going to be, some of them are going to be very focused on understanding monitoring or understanding pricing and usage models. So I've got two sessions that specifically cover business continuity, disaster recovery. It's this session that was converted from a theater session. And so I've got a longer session tomorrow that covers both the tenant, primarily focused on the tenant side of this, IaaS and PaaS, with some of the infrastructure. But really, this session was meant to cover the infrastructure side of the discussion. But, and this repeats on Thursday as well in a theater session in the Hyatt. So for those that have seen the Azure Stack keynotes and the Azure Stack sessions on overview, I think it's becoming very clear that Azure Stack is not business as usual. When it comes to infrastructure in your data center, deploying capacity around VMs and applications, business as usual just doesn't work for something like Azure Stack, in the sense that it's really an extension of Azure and the cloud in your data center, as opposed to an evolution of a virtualization stack, whether it's something like VMware or Hyper-V. So when it comes to business continuity, you're going to hear a lot of the same terms, whether it's fault tolerance, high availability, replication, backup. But the key difference is that those technologies have to sit above the infrastructure line. So if you see that horizontal line there, I'm basically separating what happens in the infrastructure from an operator perspective to what happens in the user space, what the tenants are going to do in Azure Stack when they deploy their applications. And the way to think about the infrastructure recovery is that when something really bad happens, that the stamp is wiped out or it's rendered unrecoverable, your time to recover is in days to weeks. Reason for this, I heard a wow. So if you think about hardware loss, you're ordering a new system from the OEM, and they're not shipping the systems out of their servicing depots. They're coming from manufacturing. So for example, in a Lenovo case, you're going to get a full rack, top of rack switches, BMC, servers, the whole bit. Same for all the OEMs. You're going to get a fully configured solution. And you're essentially going through the redeployment process. You're just going through the deployment process. So if your users, if your business is in the tolerance above, whether it's hours to days, minutes to hours, seconds, or zero data loss and immediate recovery, the technologies you use for the user space need to account for that, and you need to have enough infrastructure to actually handle those kind of failures. Because if you have one Azure Stack and you need to be in business within days, you're not going to meet that SLA. So we do have customers today ordering multiple Azure Stacks. They are looking at them from a DR perspective on being able to continue the business, continue servicing customers, and it's primarily around understanding how you redeploy Azure Stack. There is no such thing as failing over the infrastructure. When you would take VMware, vSphere, vCenter, replicate it to another data center, or VMM with Operations Manager in a VM, replicating it to the other side, spinning it up, and just continuing operations, that's not how Azure Stack works. You could ask, well, maybe it's because we have two separate ARM endpoints and it's two separate clouds. Even if we had multiple regions, if you have a region-wide failure, or an outage, or a disaster, you have to redeploy that region. That requires new hardware, OEMs to come out, professional services. You're redeploying the whole environment. So keep this in mind. Keep this in mind that when you're thinking about business continuity, the sensitivity or the tolerance you have in the application space needs to match how wide you deploy your infrastructure. And if you're in the zero tolerance, for example, if you're using something like zero down, where you synchronously replicate application calls, you're going to need to have another Azure Stack environment up and running. And this kind of pattern will continue even when we support multiple scale units, especially multiple regions. We're not there yet. If you've seen the overviews and if you're familiar with our roadmap, we're in the single cloud, single region, single scale unit at this point. over time, we'll add regions. So, and one more thing. Since this was meant to be a theater session, I was worried about having questions answered and not being able to hear the questions. We have 5 mics here. Now that we converted into a breakout session, so at any time, feel free to interrupt me and ask me any questions. There's 5 mics down in the front, or if you, if you decide to ask a question from your seat, I'll repeat it, but feel free to ask me any questions. So, whoops. In this conversation with customers, one of the questions that comes up is there a catch-all insurance policy? And I'm summarizing the words, but it really starts from, today, I back up everything from my Hyper-V hosts, regardless of what the customers want. I just have a backup. That's for me, my insurance policy. This is how I will continue business. What do you do with Azure Stack? You don't have access to the hosts, so you don't have the ability to install backup agents onto the hosts. You don't have the ability to install replication agents directly on the host. We've completely sealed those hosts. We whitelist all the software, and we go through device guard and credential guard, and so we've locked down what can actually run on those devices. So you can't just install something. So what happens? So the quick answer is no, there is no catch-all insurance policy. There is no way of pointing a product directly at the Hyper-V host, pulling out 200, 400 VMs in a clip, which means that if you need to recover, you're recovering the way that a customer would in Azure. They would go into their subscription, they would recover their VMs. So if they're using Azure Backup or some third-party product, the user is responsible for the protection and the recovery of their applications. If you're a managed service provider, obviously you can offer this as part of your offering, but it's still in the context of the user, not in the infrastructure. So protection of the Azure and Azure Stack is really the user responsibility, and there is no way of bulk recovering in Azure Stack. If you had something like GRS, for example, GRS is Azure's way of bulk recovering all of the storage accounts in the event of a region-wide failure. We don't support that in Azure Stack. Yes?
Couldn't you, in theory, use site recovery?
So the question is, in theory, could we use SAN recovery?
Site recovery.
Site recovery, so Azure Site Recovery. There's 2 answers to that. You can use it for the guests. At GA, it only works to Azure. And it's in the user context, right? So when we say catch-all, maybe I'm not using the right terminology. This is just what I've heard from customers. They either summarize it as a catch-all insurance policy or as a security blanket. They're basically saying, I'm going to bulk backup and I want to bulk restore. I'm doing it on behalf of all my customers, regardless of whether they ask for protection or not. In the Azure world, the bulk is done by GRS. In the event of a region-wide failure, you're going to get a storage account, but you lose all the context. So in the Azure Stack case, it's really up to the user to enable protection for their VMs. But there's no bulk recovery, is really what's happening here. Yes?
So I guess technically, I write PowerShell scripts for Azure. What's to prevent somebody from writing a bunch of PowerShell that backs up the different pieces of fabric and exports that to a bunch of XML so that that fabric could be quickly replicated on your new Azure Stack hardware?
So I haven't heard a question yet, but what would stop you from?
What's to prevent that? Because you're saying there's no way it can be done, but yet I know that there's a bunch of PowerShell panelets out there that let you export the configuration of the different pieces of fabric.
Right. So then the question is around how could an administrator or someone running Azure Stack actually do this from a script perspective in PowerShell and backing up the resources and pulling out the configuration and everything else? You're always going to do that, at least in Azure, you're doing that in the context of the user, the tenant. When we talk about infrastructure here, we're basically, that is not the same as the user and tenant. So could you do that same type of PowerShell? Absolutely. But the question that comes up the most right now is if I'm deploying this in my data center and I'm operating this thing, it's my butt on the line to get it back up and running. How do I get that up as fast as possible? That's the difference we're talking about here. And if we go back to above and below the line. So above the line, you have all the flexibility that you need to enable those scripts. The question is what happens below the line? How do you do that bulk recovery? And that's what's not in Azure Stack. And that really, it's a shift. It's a shift away from business as usual with Hyper-V or VMware. Obviously, Azure Stack starts pushing the needle when it comes to modern applications, building up containerized microservices, distributed applications, applications that you can just redeploy that sit behind a CI/CD pipeline. So you start pushing the needle that way. The old ways of backup and recovery or disaster recovery change, right? Your applications start taking on more of that, those guarantees, or have to build in those guarantees as opposed to relying purely on the infrastructure to do that. So when it comes to a disaster, it's a matter of when, not if. Right, that mentality, I think, with everything we've been seeing in the last few months, and for those that have actually lived through a disaster, it's going to happen. And being ready for that is really the start of the journey that why we're here, and what we're doing with Azure Stack, what we do with our partners, both from the OEM perspective and also from the ISV perspective. It's that journey that's going to progress to ensure that you have all the tools and mechanisms to recover Azure Stack when it happens, when a disaster happens, when you lose all your data, when there's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster. So, some of the questions that are going to come up. When this happens, from a planning perspective, really you want to look at how do you recover the Azure Stack. I'm calling it personality. Some customers understand when I say that. Really what I'm talking about is the configuration and the setup of Azure Stack, and the plans, offers, subscriptions, quotas, all of that really kind of builds the guardrails of how your users are going to use Azure Stack. To me, that's what I call personality. It's not a marketing term, it's not a product term, you're not going to see that in the product, so personality. Once you have that recovered, once you have a way of protecting that, then it's a question of how do you enable your users to actually start their journey on protecting their VM-based applications. And for the really advanced customers, what happens when there's PaaS-based applications, SQL RP, app services, functions, blockchain, all this other stuff. Obviously, we're pushing the needle there, but that's where Azure Stack obviously wants to go, is really with the modern applications. And so how do you think about those as well? Because you can't use the same tool for everything. It's going to require a different set of skill sets, and it's also going to require transfer of knowledge and responsibilities depending on where your tenants and your users sit. Okay, so if we take an example of how to protect the infrastructure, the personality, what we've done in Azure Stack is actually built something called the infrastructure backup. And this is something that's built into the product. You can access it through the admin portal. And the idea is that this data is what we collect into a share. That share could be named whatever you want. In this case, I'm naming it Redmond as the region and the external FQDN, just from a separation perspective, so you can have multiple backups in this share. And all we need at this point is just a username, password, and most importantly, an encryption key. So we use this encryption key to actually encrypt all the data before we send it out of the box. When you see it on the share, it's fully encrypted. There's some metadata and all that. But the idea is that we use an encryption key before it leaves before it leaves Azure Stack, the appliance. And setting it up fairly quickly, you can do this from the UI. One of the things that we're looking at is actually then how to start the backup. We were supposed to implement a scheduler. We don't have that at GA. So what we've done is actually provide a set of PowerShell commandlets that you can download as part of Azure Stack tools. And this is a commandlet you would use to actually initiate the backup. Now, what happens in the background is we have a workflow that goes through all of the services that need to back up their data. We pull all the data out and compress it, encrypt it, put it onto the share. Now, that backup, we're not taking full VM backups of everything. It's actually going to be around 8 to 10 gigs. So you're able to confirm the available backups that are that Azure Stack now has taken. These are in the Azure portal. They're RP. That means these backups are considered resources. And then if you look at the XML file that's available in that folder under MAS Backup, that's the folder we manage. Under the date and time, the backup ID, which is just a GUID, you'll see the backup ID, the status of that backup, and the time it took to create. The same the information that you would see up here. So that basically protects ensures that you have a backup of the personality of Azure Stack. It's squirreled away somewhere in an external share. You manage that share. It's not a share that we manage, external to the system. So in the event of a disaster, obviously you want to make sure that the blast radius that you're protecting against, or the fault domain that you're protecting against, doesn't also include this share. But at this point, you can back it up. You can put it completely off-site. The idea is that you would keep around 7 days worth of backups, because we don't need, in a disaster, I don't think you want to go back 6 months. You probably want to go back to the last backup or close to the last backup. So now the disaster actually happens. What do you do? So what we want to enable through restoring the personality is, let's say I've got 3 subscriptions here. And when I took the backup, I took it before I created that Ignite demo subscription. So the question now is, how can I ensure that I get these subscriptions back? The reason for that is, if I don't have this at the beginning, I won't actually be able to recover the subsequent set of information around resource groups, RBAC policies, Key Vault. So I actually need to seed the environment with these subscriptions. So that's what's part of the backup. That's part of the personality. So when a disaster hits, really you're going to go through a set of phases. And if you leave this session with anything, it's an understanding of the RTO associated with Azure Stack when there's catastrophic data loss. These are the phases that you would effectively go through to get everything back up and running. So, phase 0. If the partners have to come back out with new hardware and deploy Azure Stack, right? That's really partner-driven, that's OEM-driven through their professional services. You're just going through another deployment of Azure Stack. Now, what we've built into the product, we're building, so this is something that's still in development, is what's called Cloud Recovery. Cloud Recovery is an option in deployment that says, either I deploy a fresh environment with no inputs of what happened before, no personality, it's just a new one. But if you really want that personality back, and there's reasons why you want that, I'll cover that in a little bit. If you want that personality back, if you make that decision as part of the recovery, then phase 1 is where where the partner would do deployment in recovery mode. That means that the deployment will go into that share, it's going to use that encryption key, pull everything out, and then it's going to start injecting where it needs to the identities, the principals, subscriptions, plans, offers, quotas, Key Vault secrets, and RBAC policies. And all of it is automated as part of the deployment workflow. So you're not involved in actually having to stitch this together by yourself. Like that's a responsibility that we take, that we will train our partners with once it's ready. And then when this happens, it's an option that you'll have as part of the recovery mechanism. So phase 1 is over, you have a stack. You will log into your portal with the credentials you had before. In fact, your tenants can actually log in at this point and start deploying their applications. When you log in, the resources are gone, IaaS VMs are gone, everything's gone. After phase 1, you got subscriptions, plans, offers, quotas, a few resource groups, RBAC policies, Key Vault. Now, you have a choice. If you are deploying PaaS instances, PaaS resources, at this point, you install the PaaS RP, like SQL RP, app services and functions. That would be phase 2. At this point, it's not partner-driven anymore. It's admin-driven. Yes?
What about usage?
So the question is, what about usage? The data that's before the disaster, whatever data has already been pushed up to Azure, is already in Azure and accounted for.
And in a disconnected scenario?
If you're disconnected and you're not in the pay-as-you-go, you're in a consumption model. Consumption model, the usage doesn't, the meters don't account.
But I have usage to fill my
Where do you pull that out from?
The users API in Azure Stack.
Right, and that's what we keep for 6 days, for 6 months, right? So that at this point is gone. Whatever is not in, or if you're in a connected scenario with pay-as-you-go, whatever's not being already pushed into Azure, right, at this point in time is not part of the payload. Doesn't mean it won't be. It's just a matter of, it's a point-in-time statement of what we actually have. But that's great feedback. So in a disconnected scenario, getting the 6 months of data back. Now, a lot of that data already sits in ARM, and a lot of what enables what happens in cloud recovery is through ARM. So adding another set of tables or storage accounts that have to be exported is not a tall order. So it's great feedback. So phase 2 is now you're enabled SQL RP, PaaS RP, all the value-add RPs that need to be installed by the administrator. It's the operator handling this process now. Partner's done with their part, which is the redeployment, cloud recovery. They've handed over the stamp. You can log into it. That part is done. Phase 2, you take over, install the RPs. If you have them, you don't have to. If you're only using this for IaaS, obviously we encourage more PaaS, but if you're using it for IaaS and you want to get VMs back up and running, your customers have ARM templates, they need to reload those back in, you can just jump to phase 3. Phase 3 is now handed over to the, I think I changed, it should have changed this. It should say user, not tenant. We're trying to change the terminology. The user is now driving the recovery in phase 3 of their VMs. So they're loading up ARM templates, they're redeploying them, and they're getting their environments back up and running. At this point, this is the question I asked before we started. What happens if you're highly dependent on the marketplace? If you've got 30 offers that you've downloaded and syndicated from Azure to Azure Stack? At this point, that's all gone. So you'll have to syndicate again. Okay? So is there something we can do to help? Because if it's just a matter of click, 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 and syndicate, great. If there's an experience that you want to see to help accelerate some of that, then that's the feedback that I'm looking for. I mean, we don't have to talk about it here. I'm available all week, but the dev team is actually really interested in understanding if there's something that we need to do above and beyond, just making sure that you can re-syndicate. Now, phase 4 is the tenant driving the recovery of their data. If they're using PaaS data today, PaaS services, SQL, or if they've got tables and storage accounts, they're responsible for taking the snapshots of that, putting it up into Azure, or exporting it to a file share. Same thing for SQL. If they're in SQL Manager, they can export their databases, right, and put them away somewhere. If they're using Key Vault, right, even in Azure today, you have the ability to back up your secrets, put them away somewhere, and bring them back. That's really phase 4. Now, we do, as part of the phase 1 recovery, we do a recovery of Key Vault and try to do a bulk import of those keys. And the reason for that is actually seated in the fact that our CA, that's internal to the stack, generates a root certificate. That root certificate bootstraps the Key Vault RP. So if we don't bring back that certificate and bootstrap Key Vault with it, those secrets are gone. Which means that if a customer rolled their own encryption, they can never decrypt if we don't do this process. So something to keep in mind, and this is the same thing in Azure. If you take a Key Vault secret, export it, try to import it into Azure, it won't work, and vice versa. So something to keep in mind there is ensuring that Key Vault comes back and understanding how the customers are using that. If they're generating a secret that's rooted in the CA for that Azure Stack, you're going to need to make sure that cloud recovery kicks in and they get the Key Vaults back. So the idea now is that we've accelerated, the goal here is to accelerate Azure Stack recovery. We've ensured that admins can log back in, tenants can log back in. You can restart SQL, the RP installation. Now what we're doing as well as part of this phased approach in phase 2 is actually offering an ability to bulk recover SQL RP data, app services data, and functions. So how many of you have experience deploying the PaaS RP or the web services function SQL? Okay, so let's say in the app services RP, you've got the external file share, right, where you're putting all the, well, you will. In multi-node, you'll have an external file share where all the data goes. In one node, it's built in, just for convenience. So that's your responsibility to make sure that that share is backed up. That's where all the data sits. But then the question is, how can you bulk recover those applications back into Azure Stack? So you have two choices. you can install a clean RP and just let the customer redeploy. But if you want to help in the bulk recovery and accelerate some of that applications, you back up the share, restore the share, redeploy the app services RP, functions RP in effectively recovery mode as well, and we will be able to import all of the ARM information and connect it back to the share. Yep. That is the intent.
Starting from scratch is not an option, because if you give me two options, but if I have a customer doing app services, they might have source control integration and all that kind of stuff that they need to rebuild in that point in time. So I just want to say the second option, if that's a promise, I think that that's pretty good.
Okay, so right now we're in the process of building that. We are targeting 1711 for this. Sorry. 2017, month of November, is around when we're targeting this. Okay? That's what we're doing now. It may slip or not. At this point, we're still working on it, but we do want to accelerate the recovery. But really, I think the question you should also take back is, if they're using a CI/CD pipeline and they're pushing out of Visual Studio, for example, do you really need to recover that share? Because they can just redeploy, right? Right. So those are the questions you want to ask. Is if they've already got source control and if they've already got a pipeline that feeds into the system, you might not even need to recover the share and try to do a bulk recovery. It's just basically kick off your deployments back onto Azure Stack. The app services RP is back. Go and log in, do whatever you need to do. If they've already automated this and they have the infrastructure code and everything else, it's really the kind of environment we want to be in, where they just get a new region and start redeploying. Same thing would happen is if the customer, back to that two sides, if you have site 1 and site 2, if they don't have an active application, but they can redeploy very quickly, and we're seeing that with more of the advanced customers in DevOps, they just basically say, listen, my data I already copied over, I just redeploy the application. Redeploy the application, connect to the tables, connect to the storage accounts, and I'm good to go. So it really comes down to weighing the value of bulk recovery versus a pipeline that could do that for you as well. For the SQL side, we are, from an administrator perspective, you own the VMs that where SQL is deployed, then the idea is that you can use the backup agents in the SQL servers to back up all the databases. Bulk recovery just makes sure that you can manage those databases from the RP back to the SQL instance where it's deployed. If the SQL server wasn't impacted by the loss of the Azure Stack, your application is going to continue running, right? Because it's a separate server. You only use the RP for CRUD, create, delete, update operations. But that's essentially what we're linking back through the recovery. So it's a decision point now. It's where's the value of doing a fresh deployment versus something like cloud recovery? And I've already mentioned a few of them. If you have Key Vault secrets that are generated by Azure Stack and customers that are rolling their own encryption, you're going to need to go cloud recovery. Otherwise, you're not going to get those secrets back. If you do cloud recovery, we use the same deployment ID, which means you're already registered. You just have to apply the same activation data. For those that have seen the multi-node configuration, it's the same process there. We reuse as many deployment inputs as possible, which means there's also deployment inputs we can't override. So if you're in Azure AD as your authentication engine, you can't switch to ADFS in cloud recovery. You have to stick with the original authentication. You have to stay with the same region name and the same FQDN. There's too much that bleeds into the system where we can't change these. This is out there. The recovery mechanism is meant to bring back Azure Stack as close as possible to the original deployment. If you want to use this as a way of kind of merging two Azure Stacks in the future, let's say you have two separate instances, we have multi-region support, and you want to kind of wipe one out and recover it into another one, this is not the mechanism for that. This is not a merge tool for two clouds into one. This is cloud recovery. And from an RP perspective, in the cloud recovery case, you can do clean install. You can also do bulk restore. Those two would be supported. So what happens after the cloud recovery is that if you look at the portal, We will bring back everything as of the last full backup. So in this case, before I had 3. The third one was created after the backup was initiated. So what I get back now are the 2 subscriptions that are now going to seed everything else that happens from here. Resource groups, Key Vault, RBAC, and everything else. But those are the ones that we bring back. And we bring it back in the context of Azure Stack, so you're not sitting around trying to copy tables over and linking things around. Like, this is all going to be done as part of Cloud Recovery. So for those that have worked with the single node deployment, you know the inputs that are part of the install PowerShell script. So these are essentially the ones that would not be overridden. Like I mentioned, authentication, your FQDN, region name are the most important ones. And also, I would definitely want to point out that from an ASDK perspective, you can enable backup today with the single node POC. Cloud Recovery only works in multi-node environments. Reason for that is the way that we have to bring back the internal Active Directory is very specific right now to multi-node and won't work on single node. So we think this is more of a hope than a plan of record. We hope that in the future we can take a multi-node backup, and for you to validate that the backup is good and usable, to actually deploy it on a single node. And because the alternative is basically call your OEM, get professional services out there, deploy, do a DR drill on another Azure Stack that just happens to be sitting around is probably unreasonable. So we think that we either need to enable that on single node or something else. This one is still further out from November, but we know that it's a gap that we have right now. So I'm being transparent with you that it's something that we know we need to close, and we will work on this. But I'm not making any plan of record commitments right now. So to wrap up, and obviously open the floor to more questions, what we really talked about today was the infrastructure. How do you protect the infrastructure? Understanding the RTO, the recovery time objective that you need to set to get that infrastructure back in the event of a disaster. And I think what you've seen now is that getting this back in a matter of hours or days is probably unreasonable. Even if professional services come out there quickly, you're looking at days, and if you need new hardware, you're looking at weeks. So you need to account for how your applications and your business tolerance for disasters at a different level. But once you understand that, getting the infrastructure back starts with the backup. And that's what gets put onto an external share. Now, we automate the box here, the appliance, right? I'm not going to show the architecture, there's no point. We automate this piece here. What we don't automate today is the hardware lifecycle host that's deployed by every one of the partners, and also the switches, the top-of-rack switches and the BMCs. So we are working with the partners to ensure that they have the scripts and they have the guidance to make sure that those configurations can be placed onto the same share that you're using for the Azure Stack backups, but it's not automated, at least not by our process. The partners will have to provide scripts, or they'll at least provide the guidance to make sure that you can get all the information out. But that's the infrastructure, and Cloud Recovery is handled by the partner. Now, there's a whole other stack of information that we can talk about from a tenant perspective. That was not the focus of this discussion. That's tomorrow's session. BRK4010 is going to cover the rest of this. So I'm going to lightly touch on the infrastructure, and I'm going to spend the rest of the time on the top of the stack. Again, from the user's perspective. They're not from the administrative perspective. So those are the set of sessions, and this is it for the content. So I'd love to hear more questions and more feedback. And yes.
That is a lot of feedback because you're not exporting with backup the gallery items that are in Azure Stack to the marketplace, right?
Correct.
Why don't you consider taking that? And let's go back to the offline or disconnected scenario again, where we have a bunch of custom gallery items created, and we don't have source, but we need to restore them to go ahead and do some deployment.
Right.
Is that a design issue, or is that a storage amount of space issue?
So for folks that are leaving, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your attention. I hope to see you tomorrow at the 4010 session. I'm going to be around here for more. Thank you. So the first concern we had with marketplace recovery is the size of it. Like, you've got some images that could be a few hundred gigabytes of data that you're downloading. So that's one problem. The second problem is that you're actually putting that into a storage account, and you're abstracted. It's not just a share. There's a lot of metadata that goes with it. So we made a choice for now that says syndicate everything down. In the disconnected scenario, we do not have an answer. And if it's something that's important, this goes back to the design discussions that I want to have in the research panel, is what does that look like, right? Because if we do a bulk export of the same images that are already in a storage account, you're basically just going to consume bandwidth to do that. Is that the right way to, I'm asking, and we can answer this later, is that the right way to take a backup of the artifacts? Or is it something that you can hold in a source control repository that's backed up, that even if it's not coming from a CI/CD pipeline, you can at least say, this is the version that I deployed at this point in time. Because at some point, you're going to have version control that you have to account for, right?
The advantage is if you do it inside Stack, you can also alternate the store of that.
Even if it's in the like hundreds of gigs, maybe terabytes of data with every backup, is it a full backup every time? Where do we put it? So I don't know the answers, and I'm not trying to. So that's what I want to go through. Is understanding what's the right level of backup for these artifacts. How often? Where do we put the data? Do we consider maybe putting a share separately, just like we have for the app services RP, just uses a share and then presents data up to the RP? Maybe we do the same thing for something like Marketplace for these types of scenarios. I don't know the answer. But as of right now, once you lose the stack, syndicate everything back. That's the only one that would work. Sure. Yes? Sure. Yes, sir.
Just to be sure, does it work? Yeah. Just to be sure, with the GA, when I buy an Azure scale unit with multi-nodes, will it be possible right today to restore once we have the file share backup? It happens in a few weeks from now, I have the system running and it dies. Can I call my vendor for new hardware and restore?
So
or is that still under development?
The backup works today.
Yeah.
What we're working on right now is the restore. So there's two types of restore that we're working on. Same hardware, same configuration, in-stamp restore, and cross-stamp restore. If you have to order new hardware, maybe you were 12 nodes, you only have budget for 8 or 4. Right now, the backup data that we have is not hardware specific, meaning we're not bound to the 12 nodes that you had before.
Yeah,
but that's the stuff that we are testing right now to make sure that it works in cross and in stamp. That's what's delaying us to November 2017, is making sure we've done all the testing. But from a backup perspective, if you look at that share, it's got Key Vault and RBAC and everything else.
Okay, but we still need to be very careful, because as of today, even if we have a backup, we cannot yet restore the stamp from that backup.
No, with the builds you're going to get once your partners can actually deploy, it's not capable to do a restore yet.
Okay.
A lot of these partners actually haven't been fully trained on this either, because it's a late-breaking set of changes, so we actually have to go through that process as well.
Yeah, okay.
And then the partners have to understand, they have to come up with a statement that says, this is how we would support this.
Yeah.
So there's work we still need to do. But we've completed the backup work. It's part of ASDK. We're missing the restore step, the recovery step now.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Yes. Oh, sorry, I think I'll go. Right, go ahead.
So I just had a question about the POC. Why don't you guys make it to where you can have a maximum of 4 nodes in the POC? That would make a lot more sense, especially if you're trying to restore data or test the backup to a multi-node. You wouldn't have to necessarily change your code for what you have right now. You can actually run it directly on the POC instead of maintaining 2 code bases. It just would make more sense to me. Have the ability to actually go in and do a multi-node deployment on POC. Just limit it to 4 nodes, because there's not really a lot of support for it, obviously, because it's POC. But you could at least, be able to do a restore to it or something.
Yeah, and the complications we get into once you expand beyond 1 comes down to the configuration and networking, the configuration of storage. It's very specific, and we prescribed with all the partners as part of the co-engineering effort. If you were to just take that and slap it on any hardware, it's going to go pretty bad. It requires a very specific network configuration, and in order for us to control that, we have to have access to the switches. And in a development environment, in a proof of concept, you may not have that flexibility, or you might not have the right switches with the right configuration. So it's more complicated. Yeah, it's not two code bases. I mean, it is the same one effectively, but we assume a lot of pre-configuration, and the partners go through what's called a deployment worksheet that figures out all of the networking configuration, the topology, and everything else. That if you get it wrong, it's not a great experience. Even in a proof of concept, things will fail, won't perform right, and it's not something that we've designed.
Well, it's definitely not something you want to run, obviously, and test it in production. I mean, it's for backup testing. It's just to validate that things did restore. You can log into your application. You know, your past service is actually running.
So I think if, from a restore perspective, we are considering other options that would even avoid having to do that. So we think we need a better mechanism. Even if it's like single node, we think we can do better. So for that specific reason, I don't even think we need to touch ASDK for that. But it's a longer ways out just because of the engineering time that we need.
I still think you need to have multi-node.
It's good feedback, though. Thank you.
It really, well, so one more point.
Sure.
It's just because, so if you're using it for development, you have to test it out to see if it's something you actually want. In single node, even if you get something that's a really beefy box, like 256 gigs of RAM, 512 gigs of RAM, dual quad-core or 8-core procs, whatever, you're really limited on what resources you can really do or even provide a development team on a single node. So being able to expand it to at least 2 or 4 nodes for whatever redundancy just makes a lot more sense, especially if you have a large customer who's really looking into it.
I think that's good too. I mean, from a capacity perspective, what would stop you from deploying multiple POCs?
Well, so your marketplace, and then you have, 185 days trial period, otherwise it bombs.
Okay.
So that's actually in your
Separate
currently.
tenants. Each PLC would be a different tenant, so,
That's also true.
yeah, I mean,
That's what we've seen. We've seen a lot of partners, service providers as well, that want to offer a dev environment. They just spin up a single node POC with enough to run that tenant.
I suppose you could do that.
but if you have a tenant that, if you're virtualizing a very large workload
Yep.
in IaaS, sometimes we have single host per VM kind of virtualization
I
going
see.
on because we got a SQL server that's got, insert your amount of RAM here, running how many instances of SQL, and they want to set up always on cluster. Now you've got 2 different tenants, 2 different SQL servers, and you're having to figure out how to try to.
And there
get
are
that
multiple
to-
portals to admin, it's on sites as well, so.
Yeah.
It's a blood.
That's a pretty complicated customer and an advanced customer. So,
Believe it or not so much anymore.
Okay.
Several of them that do that because they're running like test data through something like Splunk, and so they're running huge SQL servers because they're running huge amounts of test data.
so some of the partners, some of the partners can do 256, 512 gigs of RAM. Is it a concern with scaling up a node and the cost of that? Like if you can get a partner that can do 1.5 terabytes of RAM
Okay.
with enough cores, like would that solve the problem or?
Well, so potentially, I suppose it could, but you're looking at spending, at that point, you're looking at spending like $250,000 for the node. If like I have 4 procs with 8 cores in it and 1.5 terabytes of RAM and 12 SSDs inside, it's going to be a sizable chunk of change just for POC.
Right.
It would make more sense for the end customer to have a system that was, like maybe last generation. It's still relatively new enough that you can still, run RDMA NICs and whatever else you need to. But it would just
That's where the problem starts coming in. When you get into the complex network configuration, we've had to be really restrictive on how that's done. And that's what makes it difficult to say, take a POC and add nodes.
yeah, your POC doesn't really matter, I guess, because it's single NIC anyway. But whatever because like I said, you can always use last year's model in the POC. That's one of the benefits of it. But being able to scale it out for servers, because if you were re-provisioning servers because you have moved stuff to the cloud, so now you have empty boxes that you can use for development.
Right.
To a customer, that seems like a better investment than having to spend $250,000 buying a box just to run a POC on.
And these are customers that can't develop it or could they dev test in Azure? before they deploy in Azure Stack? Like what drives the need to make it local for dev test now at that scale?
Regulation.
Okay, so these are customers that can't go to Azure anyway.
Yeah,
Got it.
usually, or the, you know, the whole, like, we don't do cloud, you know.
Okay.
Well, we do, sorry, we do private cloud, we don't do public cloud.
Okay,
Even though it's the same, you know, concept, or we do semi-private cloud.
all right. It's good feedback. You know, come by the booth, talk to Spencer Shepler as well. He's the architect from the hardware perspective. And, you know, it's a good conversation. I'm going to say up front right now, it's going to be one of those things that we're not going to focus on. But I think as we get more interest, I mean, the amount of interest we get already is high. And if we get pushed for more, I mean, we're going to have to think of something to respond to this. It's great feedback. Thank you.
Which Spencer, I'm sorry?
Spencer Shepler.
Shepard.
Yep.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Sure. Any other questions? Yes.
Is there any way third-party backup software can protect VMs in Azure Stack?
From the guest perspective, yes. From the infrastructure, no. That's what I'm going to cover tomorrow in the 4010 session. Yeah, but right now, every form of protection would be within the guest.
No plans to allow that in future?
No, that's going to be a design decision, and it's really focused on Azure consistency, because in Azure, you don't get access to the host either. You get platform capabilities on the storage side, which a lot of partners are going to, but not the infrastructure. So we are aligning with that pattern.
So there also an item, post-J item, where ASR and Azure backup, they can backup protect the VMs. So how is that?
Today, they're working in the guest, and tomorrow, you know, post-GA, no timeline at this point. Post-GA will enable the storage APIs that Azure already has, that partners are already using anyway, to do that. But again, not at the infrastructure.
But then third-party backup software can use same infrastructure.
If you're already in Azure and using the APIs in Azure, the idea is that we will sync up to those APIs, and then you can use the same workflows on Azure Stack. Snapshot, diff, everything else.
That way it can be done.
Right. Then you get consistency. You don't have to rewrite your software twice. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, you said this in the beginning, but I'm kind of new to this myself. Elaborating on what he was just asking.
Oh.
What you can do today is use Azure Backup to get infrastructure, but it's within the Azure cloud environment only, not on-prem. Did I catch that right? In the beginning, the limitations you were describing in the beginning.
So the limitations are really in the context of Azure Stack and grabbing its infrastructure data, right? Is that what you're talking about, the workflows that we offer for that versus what you do in the tenant space?
I think.
Yeah, so from a tenant perspective, what you do today in Hyper-V or VMware, you install an agent on the host and you back up all the VMs from the host perspective. You don't have that capability in Azure Stack. You have to do it from the user perspective from within the guest, just like you would in Azure as well.
So you can install like a bare metal, you know, guest agent and do a backup and then create a new VM and use that.
You could do that as well. You have Veeam, they can do direct restore, things like that. So I need to shut off the mic, but I'm going to be here for a few more minutes, guys. Thank you very much. And if you get a chance to do the evaluation as well, please.